Okay. Right. Good morning. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of Denmark, France, Greece, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom. We welcome the important progress that's been made in recent months to end the bloodshed in Gaza, secure the release of the hostages, and turn the page on 2 tragic years of conflict. We welcome the efforts of the US, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey to achieve a ceasefire and set out a 20-point plan for Gaza's future. We call on all parties to fully implement Security Council Resolution 2803 in a manner consistent with international law, including international humanitarian law. This must include respecting the ceasefire, facilitating the rapid, massive, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid to all civilians in desperate need throughout the whole of Gaza, and through relevant organizations, including the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and their NGO partners. As well as ensuring the remains of the final deceased hostage, Ran Gavili, are located and handed over swiftly. We also call upon Hamas to disarm and renounce violence in line with the 20-point plan. We reiterate our unwavering commitment to the 2-state solution and stress the importance of unifying the Gaza Strip with the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, under the Palestinian Authority. In line with the New York Declaration, we underline the need for a time-bound process to achieve the conclusion and implementation of a just and comprehensive peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. While the international community is focused on building a peaceful and prosperous future for Gaza, we must not forget what is happening in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Today, the Council will meet to discuss Resolution 2334, which explicitly condemns settlement activities and calls on Israel to respect its obligations under international law. Yet the government of Israel continues to implement policies which contravene this resolution and contribute to rising instability in the West Bank. This risks undermining the implementation of the 20-point plan for Gaza and the prospects for a 2-state solution, as well as long-term peace and security across the region. We strongly condemn the unprecedented rise in settler violence against Palestinian civilians of all faiths and denominations in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, with 2025 the most violent year on record. According to UN OCHA, there were over 260 attacks on Palestinians and their property in October alone. This is deeply alarming. These attacks terrorize civilians, obstruct peace efforts, and threaten the security of Israel itself. We call on the government of Israel to abide by its obligations under international law and protect the Palestinian population of the occupied territories. We reiterate our call for the preservation of and respect for the status quo of Jerusalem's holy sites. We take note of recent condemnations of settler violence by President Herzog and Prime Minister Netanyahu. This must be translated into concrete action that addresses the root causes of this violence, restores stability, and holds those responsible to account. We reiterate our firm opposition to any form of annexation and to the government of Israel's settlement policies that violate international law. The allocation of 2.7 billion shekels of funding for settlements, evictions of Palestinian families from Silwan in East Jerusalem, plans to initiate land registration in the Area C of the West Bank, approval of the E1 settlement, and thousands of new housing units all risk destabilization and undermine the viability of a 2-state solution. UNRWA must also be able to continue its vital work, and we welcome the renewal of its mandate and UNRWA's commitment and ongoing efforts to implement the recommendations of the Colonna report. We are shocked by Israeli authorities entering UNRWA's compound in East Jerusalem on 8 December without prior authorization. UN premises are inviolable under international law. Such actions undermine respect for international norms and the ability of UN agencies to deliver essential services to Palestinians. We welcome the ICG advisory opinion of October 2025 and call on Israel to act fully in line with its obligations under international law. Finally, the economic situation in the West Bank remains precarious. The continued withholding of Palestinian tax revenues, threats to withdraw correspondent banking relationships, and limits on shekel transfers are wholly unjustifiable. These measures risk financial collapse in the West Bank and a fiscal crisis for the Palestinian Authority, weakening its ability to deliver services, reform, and assume responsibilities in Gaza as envisaged in Security Council Resolution 2803. The government of Israel must urgently release withheld revenues, remove or significantly increase shekel transfer limits, and confirm a longer-term extension for correspondent banking relationships to avert economic collapse and uphold prospects for peace and stability. We're deeply concerned by the movement restrictions, forced displacement, and the conduct of operations by Israeli security forces in the West Bank, aggravating the humanitarian situation, and call for their immediate end. In closing, we now stand at a historic crossroads with a chance to secure a better future and deliver long-term peace for Israelis, Palestinians, and the region. We remain fully committed to this vision and reaffirm our commitment to achieving a just and comprehensive resolution of the Israel-Palestinian conflict based on a two-state solution. Thank you.
Ask a question on the terror designation reported in the US.
US is missing. Oh no, she's here. Good morning. The 10,068th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Alakbarov, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of the item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of the Council members to document S/2025/807, the report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. I now give the floor to Mr. Alakbarov.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, today's briefing is devoted to the Secretary General's quarterly report on the implementation of the Resolution 2334. Before turning to the report, allow me a few remarks. At the outset, I reiterate the Secretary General condemnation of Sunday's heinous terror attack on Jewish families gathered to celebrate Hanukkah in Sydney, Australia. I share in the grief of the Jewish community and stand with Jewish families worldwide as they mark the festival of Hanukkah, which celebrate light vanquishing darkness. Mr. President, turning to the situation in Gaza, the ceasefire remains fragile, as we have seen with continued attacks and strikes in Gaza. I welcome the ongoing efforts by the mediators to avert further escalation, support implementation of the current commitments, including the recovery and return of the last Israeli hostage, and to advance discussions on the next phase and implementation of the comprehensive Gaza in line with UN Security Resolution 2803. The UN is doing its part to support the ceasefire and meet the staggering needs of the population. The UN's winterization efforts are underway, distributing tents, blankets, and other essential supplies, reaching people where they are. But conditions remain dire, and the risk of hypothermia is increasing with the onset of the winter weather. Tragically, the first hypothermia-related death, a 2-week-old newborn boy from Khan Yunis, was early. Preserving and expanding of space with humanitarian partners, including through the UN. I welcome the partial reopening of the Alamba King Hussein Bridge crossing for the transfer of aid to Gaza following a deadly attack on Israeli soldiers there in September. However, supplies through this route are currently capped at low levels. Large quantities of aid are prepositioned in warehouses in Jordan, awaiting full resumption. I urge the authorities of Israel to enable the timely and at-scale movement of life-saving assistance through the independent Jordan Coordinator. Mr. President, indeed concerning development on 8 December, Israeli authorities forcibly entered the UNRWA compound in East Jerusalem, seizing property and replacing the UN flag with Israeli flag. The Secretary General strongly condemned these actions and emphasized that the compound remains United Nations premises and is inviolable and immune from any other form of interference. On 11 December, Israeli cabinet decided to approve or regularize 19 settlements in the occupied West Bank. This includes the settlements of Ganim and Kadim in the northern West Bank, which has been evacuated by Israel in 2005. Mr. President, I will now turn to highlighting some of the Secretary General's observation on the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2334 of the year 2016 during the reporting period. I welcome the ceasefire in Gaza based on U.S. President's plan to end the Gaza conflict and through the tireless mediation efforts of Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and the United States. The ceasefire offers a critical opportunity to halt the bloodshed and improve the humanitarian situation. I urge Israel and Hamas to fully implement the ceasefire, exercise maximum restraint, and adhere to international law, including relevant UN resolutions. The ceasefire must be consolidated to enable recovery and reconstruction in Gaza. The United Nations stands ready. I welcome the release of all living hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, and I am relieved that families are being reunited after long periods of anguish. I call for the immediate return of the remains of the last deceased hostage. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, has been indispensable in I reiterate the protection of the report, including sexual violence and by the withholding of some families. I unequivocally condemn the killing and injury of civilians in Gaza, including children and women. While the ceasefire has largely held, periodic Israeli military strikes continue, causing significant civilian casualties and extensive damages to homes and infrastructure. Armed Palestinian attacks against Israeli soldiers have also continued. Gunfire and shelling near withdrawal lines and attacks on civilians attempting to return home or access land have resulted in further loss of life. Such incidents must immediately cease. I am deeply concerned by the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where infrastructure damage is catastrophic. While hunger has improved due to increased aid and commercial foods, out of reach for most of the population, alongside with severe sources of clean water, medical care, and shelter. Humanitarian access remains restricted, with aid convoys facing logistical and security obstacles. I call on all parties to respect humanitarian law and allow the full unimpeded entry of humanitarian assistance. I condemn relentless Israeli settlement expansions in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which fuels tensions, impedes Palestinian land access, and threatens the viability of the contiguous and sovereign Palestinian state. The expanding or settlement, including outposts, coincides with rising settler attacks, further entrenching the unlawful occupation and violating international law, undermining Palestinian self-determination. All Israeli settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and related infrastructure have no legal validity and violate international law and UN resolutions. In 2025, settlement advancement reached its highest point since UN began tracking in 2017. I urge Israel to abide by its obligation under international law, recalling the International Court of Justice opinion of 19 July 2024, which obliges Israel to cease all settlement activities, evacuate settlers, and end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory promptly. Escalating violence and tensions in the West Bank are alarming. Israeli security operations in the Northwest Bank caused high fatalities, population displacement, and large-scale destruction, especially in refugee camps. Continued Israeli security presence in camps contravenes obligations to end the unlawful occupation. I condemn rising settler violence across the West Bank, which intensified during the olive harvest. Attacks have become more frequent and violent, often with the presence or support of Israeli security forces. Palestinian farmers have faced assault, harassment, and obstruction from their lands. Olive trees are uprooted or burned, and the entire harvest destroyed. These attacks deprive families of vital livelihoods and risk forcible displacement. Israeli authorities must prevent attacks, hold perpetrators accountable, and ensure the safe access for farmers. I condemn continued armed attacks by Palestinians against Israelis. All violence against civilians, including terror, must cease immediately, with perpetrators held accountable. I remain concerned about large numbers of Palestinians, including children, detained by Israel since 7 October 2023, including administrative detention without charge or trial. Reports of torture, ill treatment, including sexual violence, and deaths in custody are deeply concerning. Israel must use detention as a last resort for the shortest period, prevent ill treatment, and end administrative detention of children. I'm appalled by officials glorifying violence and engaging in dangerous provocations, incitement, and inflammatory language. Incitement to violence must stop immediately. I am deeply concerned by the Palestinian authorities' prolonged fiscal crisis, further destabilizing the economy, undermining trust, exacerbating insecurity, and eroding social order. Israeli authorities must seek unilateral economic measures that threaten peace and stability. I remain committed to supporting Palestinians and Israel, resolving the conflict in line with international law, UN resolution, and bilateral agreements, pursuing a two-state vision, Israel and a fully independent, democratic, contiguous, viable, sovereign Palestinian state, including Gaza, living side by side in peace and security, based on pre-1967 lines with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Alakbarov for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. France condemned in the strongest terms the horrific anti-Semitic terrorist attack that has affected Australia. Nothing can justify such violence, and we have presented our condolences to the victims, to their families, and to the Australian people. Mr. President, grateful to the Deputy Special Coordinator, Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, for his briefing. A month ago, the Council adopted Resolution 2803, aimed at implementing the peace plan for Gaza presented by President Trump. This resolution endorsed the progress obtained over the past few months, and in particular supporting the efforts of the U.S., Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. The ceasefire, the release of hostages, and resumption still insufficient of humanitarian assistance. This is a first step which must be fully consolidated. The ceasefire must be fully respected by the parties, and the massive delivery of humanitarian aid must be ensured throughout Gaza by the United Nations and their partners. The last body of a hostage must be returned. It's also urgent to allow for the deployment of the International Stabilization Force, the disarmament of Hamas, and withdrawal of Israeli forces. In parallel, the establishment of a transition government in Gaza must lead to a return of a reformed Palestinian Authority, and France intends to fully contribute to these efforts. At the same time, the situation in the West Bank and the East Bank and the East Jerusalem, is deteriorating severely, marked by an alarming intensification of violence. France would like to recall that the future of Gaza and of the West Bank are interconnected. Violence in the West Bank compromises prospects for lasting peace and security for Palestinians and for Israelis. The success of the peace plan for Gaza and regional stability. Mr. President, I'd like to insist on 5 very worrisome developments currently underway in the West Bank. First of all, Israeli military operations are intensifying, with the launch of a major operation in the north, leading to the forced displacement of populations, in particular in refugee camps, and violations of human rights. The summary execution of 2 unarmed Palestinians by Israeli border guards in Jenin is a tragic illustration of this violence. This incident must be fully investigated. Secondly, A massive increase of violence by settlers against Palestinian civilians has sowed terror and compromised the stability of the West Bank, as well as prospects for global comprehensive peace and security. France calls Israel to protect the Palestinian population and to punish the perpetrators of the violence. Thirdly, the recent approval by the Israeli government of 19 new outposts and the settler project E1 constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and a blow to the two-state solution. We reiterate our condemnation of the expansion of settlements and our opposition to any form of annexation of the West Bank, whether it's partial, total, or de facto. Fourthly, the persistent threats against the work of UNRWA are unacceptable, in particular the raid of its facilities in East Jerusalem in violation of the status of UN facilities. Any additional hindrance to the action of UNRWA, which plays a central role for the Palestinian population, would go against the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of the 22nd of October of 2025. We call on Israel to lift all obstacles to humanitarian aid and to cooperate with UN agencies. Conformity with this advisory opinion, including by opening all the crossing points and by ceasing to refuse in an arbitrary way the delivery of essential goods for the survival of the population delivered by the UN. Fifthly, the persistent refusal by the Israeli government to restore to the Palestinian Authority its tax receipts and renew the system of banking corresponding banks is unjustifiable. The weakening of the Palestinian Authority compromised its ability to implement reforms and assume its responsibilities in Gaza as anticipated by Resolution 2803. Its financial collapse would be a serious threat to regional stability and to the security of Israel. Mr. President, to conclude, France reaffirms its commitment to the two-state solution with a state of Palestine living in peace and security side by side with Israel. This is the only credible horizon for peace and security for everyone in the region in conformity with the New York Declaration adopted in September by a very broad majority in the General Assembly. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Deputy Special Coordinator Alakbarov for his briefing on the implementation of Resolution 2334. This resolution is a clear message of law and responsibility. It affirmed that the Israeli actions in the occupied Palestinian Authority constitute violation of international humanitarian law. Yet, what has followed is not compliance, but defiance, an open disregard not only for international law, but for the authority of this council itself. President, this is the last meeting on the question of Palestine in which my delegation, the delegation of Algeria, participates as an elected member of this council. One might therefore ask, is it still worth repeating what is already written, what is already documented? And should I say, what has been ignored? The Secretary General has spoken. His report has spoken. The fact on the ground has spoken clearly, accurately, relentlessly. In the West Bank, settlements have reached their highest recorded level. Legislative steps have been taken to extend Israeli occupation law to settlements. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been forcibly displaced. More than 1,000 military operations have resulted in the detention of over 860 Palestinians, among them at least 50 children. 50 children. Settlers' terrorism has become a daily occurrence, averaging 5 incidents a day throughout this year. Just yesterday, Israeli forces demolished 2 more buildings in Ramallah and in East Jerusalem. Thus, more than 1,000 demolitions have been carried out since October 2023. And in the few next days, 100 homes, Palestinian homes, are planned to be demolished. This is not an anomaly. It is not a deviation. It is the routine of occupation. An occupation administered with precision and sustained by silence, our silence. And so we must ask, Mr. President, what has this Council done to ensure the implementation of its own resolutions? The answer does not require debate. It requires honesty, simply honesty. This Council did nothing. Nothing. Had such violations unfolded elsewhere, this chamber would have moved swiftly. Sanctions imposed, accountability mechanism activated, perpetrators named and restrained. Here, however, the opposite has occurred. Protection, yes, protection instead of pressure. Reward instead of restraint. It is not this climate of immunity, of impunity, that has emboldened the Israeli occupying authorities to assault. Just last week, the headquarters of UNRWA, an act Algeria condemns strongly. UN premises are inviolable under international law. This is not a subject of interpretation. It is an obligation. Mr. President, I had also intended to speak of Gaza. But Gaza no longer needs description. Gaza needs protection. Despite the ceasefire endorsed by Resolution 2803, catastrophe persists. As we have seen in Lebanon and Syria, Israeli occupying forces continue to act, continue to bomb, as though ceasefire arrangement bind everyone except themselves. Since the ceasefire entered into effect, airstrikes have continued across the Strip, killing at least 356 Palestinians, including women, and at least 50 children. Sorry, every life count, 58 children, and enduring more than 1,000 others. Since the ceasefire entered into effect, nearly 600 violations were recorded. This is not a ceasefire. A ceasefire violated daily ceases to exist. It becomes merely the management of violence. The normalization of death. Israel's genocidal war on Gaza continue unabated. And we therefore call upon the guarantors of the ceasefire. Yes, the guarantors of the ceasefire to uphold their responsibility, to have the courage to uphold their responsibilities, not rhetorically, but practically, not selectively, but fully, to ensure that the Israeli occupying power complies with its commitment in good faith, without exception and without delay. Mr. President, 2 years have passed. Yet, for the Palestinian people, they have amounted to an entire age, a period marked by a brutal aggression by the Israeli occupying forces. An aggression directed to existence itself in an attempt to annihilate, yes, annihilate a people, to uproot them from their land and resurrect the tragedies of the Nakba with all the pain, the displacement, and deprivation it carries. During this period, the price paid in Palestinian blood has been without precedent in the Middle East. In Gaza alone, more than 70,000 people have been killed and over 170,000 wounded. These are figures that bear witness to the scale of the tragedy, a tragedy that targeted children and women, journalists and humanitarian workers, doctors and relief personnel. A tragedy from which even United Nations staff were not spared. It is among the darkest chapters humanity has known in this century. It is among the greatest tests of the conscience of humankind. Confronted with the enormity of this suffering and the magnitude of the catastrophe, Algeria, throughout its membership in this council, sought to stand by its Palestinian brothers and sisters, sought to spare no efforts to lift the injustice, yes, the injustice inflicted upon them. Yet it became painfully clear that the Israeli occupation enjoys impunity within this council. This is a moment when the very legitimacy of the international system has come under question, and its effectiveness under doubt. Gaza has laid bare, as has Palestinian as a whole, the reality of an international order that no longer recognizes anything but force. A message echoing across the world that the logic of power has become the principal driver of international relations at the expense of law, of justice, and the principles upon which this organization, the United Nations, was founded. In closing, Mr. President, as Algeria concludes its term in the Security Council, it reiterates again and again, as affirmed by the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, and I quote, "Algeria will remain faithful to its commitment in support of our brothers and sisters in occupied Palestine. Algeria will spare no effort in defending their legitimate rights until full sovereignty is restored and the free, independent state of Palestine is established." I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Deputy Special Coordinator of the United Nations for the Middle East peace process, Alakbarov, for the detailed briefing on the situation on the occupied Palestinian territory in the context of the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. It is with deep regret that we are compelled, following the briefer, to observe the fact that the long-anticipated ceasefire in Gaza did not usher in alleviation of the plight of the residents of the West Bank, where, in addition to frequent military raids, the Israelis have launched a military operation in Tubas and Jenin. Since late September in the West Bank of Jordan River, including East Jerusalem, Israeli security forces and armed settlers have killed more than 40 Palestinians. More than 800 were wounded. And in October, the settlers carried out more than 260 attacks, which broke the record since 2006. These attacks became a part of a systematic campaign not just to intimidate local residents, but also to strip them of means of existence. These settler raids targeting olive harvests, together with the drought and unlimited access of farmers and agricultural workers to their lands, have already resulted in the lowest harvests since 2025, and this is the main source of revenue for the residents of the West Bank. The plans for the construction of new Israeli settlements on the West Bank are moving apace at a record tempo. In 2024, there were 26,170 housing units approved for erection, and in 2025, that number nearly doubled, reaching 47,390 units. In parallel, an illusion is being established of a legal justification for this illegal expansion. On the 12th of December, the Israeli Ministerial Cabinet decided to legalize the 19 settlements on the West Bank to give them a legal status. The Israeli leadership also clings to the idea of the de facto annexation of the West Bank of the Jordan River. In the Knesset, a bill is under consideration to repeal the prohibition on Jews gaining access to land in this part of the OPT. Against this backdrop, there's an ongoing practice of demolition of Palestinian units under the pretext of an absence of Israeli authorities granting permission, which is virtually impossible to secure. Since late September, 152 Palestinian housing units were demolished, and 24 of them, incidentally, had to be destroyed by the Palestinians themselves in order to avoid very high fines. This grotesque state of affairs reflects the true approach to the Palestinian people on the part of, according to what the U.S. colleagues assert, is the only democracy in the Middle East. I also wish to draw attention to the reprehensible raid of Israel targeting the UNRWA facilities in East Jerusalem on the 8th of October. Such acts fly in the face of the United Nations Convention on Privileges and Immunities. We also wish to recall the advisory opinion of the ICJ dating 22 October 2025. Relating to Israel's obligation regarding the presence and activities of the United Nations, other international organizations, and third states on the OPT. A General Assembly resolution was adopted on 12 December in support of that. We support the ongoing interrupted work of the UNRWA, which is the only source to which there's no alternative for comprehensive assistance to the Palestinians, both on the OPT and neighboring Arab lands. The large-scale, deliberate destruction of UNRWA facilities and the death of its staff must not remain unpunished. Mr. President, speaking of Gaza, there's a need to recognize that as part of the implementation of Donald Trump's plan, it has been possible to stem the large-scale bloodletting and hunger in the Strip. However, a lasting ceasefire has not been achieved. Since the 10th of October, Israel rained approximately 800 strikes down on Gaza, as a result of which at least 386 people died. The Israeli side continues to position significant obstacles to delivery of humanitarian assistance. The flow of cargo cleared for import only covers 35% of the needs, and entire categories of objects are arbitrarily being prohibited under the pretext of their being dual use in nature. Under these circumstances, the responsibility for the implementation of the provisions of the Comprehensive Peace Plan Palestine and Gaza lies with the United States and those states who publicly supported the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2803. We trust that the future transitional structures in the enclave will be formulated while taking into account the views of Ramallah, and the handover of authority to the PNA in the sector will take place in the foreseeable future. We believe that matters related to the future of Gaza need to be considered as being part and parcel of the main part of the OPT. A key role in Donald Trump's plan is set out for the ISF. 1 month after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2803, it remains unclear which states are willing to join this mission. And we do not think this is not a coincidence. It is one matter to deploy specialists for a peacekeeping operation who will deal with ceasefire monitoring, deconfliction, and facilitating the restoration of the Palestinian security forces. It is another matter to have units whose goal is to attempt through force to compel the Palestinian fighters to relinquish weapons. This objective is liable to transform the ISF into a party to the conflict with all of the attendant consequences, which multiply security risks for the foreign contingents deployed there. One cannot expect the ISF to achieve the impossible. We urge mediators to focus on seeking launch comprehensive negotiations to resolve the issue of disarmament of Palestinian groups and withdrawal of Israeli units from Gaza. The whole world has witnessed the horrors of a military attempts at military solution over the past 2 years. The time is ripe for real diplomacy on the ground, real diplomacy which has nothing to do with loud proclamations, real diplomacy which requires compromise and calm. Russia had and continues to embrace a principled position of Palestinian-Israeli settlement. Over the course of the wave of the recent outbreak of conflict and escalation, we called for immediate, unconditional, comprehensive ceasefire with the delivery of safe and unimpeded humanitarian assistance in accordance with the well-known guiding principles. We call for the launch of the peace process on a universally recognized international legal basis, including a two-state solution which will usher in the creation of an independent, viable state of Palestine within the 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. At the same time, we consistently advocate uncompromising efforts to combat terrorism and extremism in all of their forms and their manifestations. For this reason, we vehemently condemned the barbaric extremist attack targeting Sydney during the commemorations of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah on the 14th of December, as a result of which innocent civilians, including a Russian compatriot, died. We extend our deepest condolences to the families of the dead, and we wish a speedy recovery to those who have been injured. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I wish to begin by expressing our condolences to the victims of the mass shooting that struck Sydney, Australia, and expressing our solidarity with the bereft families and those injured. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Mr. Alakbarov for his briefing. When the Middle East is in turmoil, the world cannot be at peace. The Palestinian question remains at the very heart of the challenges in the Middle East. The latest outbreak of the Gaza conflict has brought unimaginable suffering to both Palestinian and Israeli civilians and triggered severe spillover effects across the Middle East. While the first phase ceasefire agreement in Gaza has been reached, the prospect of peace remains distant. The historical injustices endured by the Palestinian people persist. The Palestinian question should never be relegated to the margins. The international community must further build consensus and take more proactive actions to advance a political solution. First, violent conflict must not resume. A comprehensive and lasting ceasefire in Gaza must be secured. Over the past 2 months, frequent violations of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza have resulted in the death of over 300 civilians. Reaching a ceasefire agreement must entail the complete cessation of all hostilities, not merely a downgrade from intense conflict to a low-intensity attacks. Any reckless violation of the agreement could jeopardize and ultimately collapse the tenuous ceasefire. China calls on all parties, Israel in particular, to immediately fulfill their commitments under the ceasefire agreement, refrain from actions that could escalate tensions, and work toward achieving a genuine, comprehensive, and lasting ceasefire. Relevant mediating parties should take concrete steps to ensure the implementation of the ceasefire agreement. Second, the suffering of civilians must not continue. Urgent action is needed to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Winter storms have brought torrential rains, inundating numerous temporary camps and placing hundreds of thousands of displaced people under severe threat. Israel's continued restrictions on access to essential supplies are impeding the efforts of UNRWA and other humanitarian agencies to deliver critical assistance. Last week, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted a resolution supporting the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which clearly affirms Israel's obligations as the occupying power to ensure humanitarian supplies to Gaza and to cooperate with UNRWA and other relevant agencies. China urges Israel to earnestly fulfill its obligations under international law, open all border crossings, lift access restrictions on humanitarian supplies, and support the work of the UN and other aid agencies. Third, the situation in the West Bank must not be overlooked. Unilateral actions in violation of international law must cease immediately. The occupying power continues to advance settlement policies, demolish Palestinian homes, condone settler violence resulting in massive civilian casualties and displacement. Settlement activities violate international law and Council Resolution 2334, shrinking Palestinian living space and eroding the foundations of the two-state solution. We call on Israel to immediately cease all settlement activities, curb settler violence, and refrain from undermining the governance foundations of the Palestinian Authority. This includes the prompt return of withheld tax revenues and the removal of restrictions imposed on the Palestinian economy. Fourth, justice and fairness must prevail. The two-state solution must be implemented without delay. Implementing the two-state solution, establishing an independent state of Palestine, is the only viable path to resolving the Palestinian question. Any arrangements concerning Gaza's future must be guided by the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine. Any attempt to alter Gaza's territorial or demographic composition must be firmly rejected. 1 month has passed since the Security Council adopted Resolution 2803. The relevant country should act with a sense of responsibility toward the Palestinian people, the Security Council, and the international community by providing timely updates to the Council and ensuring the Council's close and sustained attention and effective engagement. The international community must redouble its efforts to advance the two-state solution, support the early establishment of an independent state of Palestine, and facilitate its full membership in the UN. President, China firmly supports the just cause of the Palestinian people in restoring their legitimate national rights. Recently, President Xi Jinping has on multiple occasions comprehensively articulated China's position and proposals for resolving the Palestinian question and announced that China will provide $100 million in assistance to Palestine to help alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and support its recovery and reconstruction. China will continue to work with the international community to promote a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire in Gaza, alleviate the humanitarian crisis, and make unremitting efforts towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the Palestinian question at an early date. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Deputy Special Coordinator Alakbarov. Before I begin, I want to pause to remember those killed and injured on Bondi Beach this weekend, celebrating Hanukkah. This attack must be called for what it is: anti-Semitic terrorism. President Trump and the U.S. government will continue to combat anti-Semitism wherever it occurs, including here at the United Nations. Last week, Ambassador Waltz traveled to Jordan and Israel, where he had the honor of spending time with the mother and father of Police Sergeant Ran Gavili, the last remaining hostage in Gaza. There, Ambassador Waltz learned of Rand's heroism. While off from work on medical leave, he saved dozens of lives before he was ultimately injured in a firefight and dragged to Gaza on the back of a motorbike. The world knows that Hamas and its affiliates knew the location of every hostage, and President Trump was clear. As part of the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, every hostage must come home. Rand's body must be returned to his parents and siblings now. We cannot move forward until he is home. Ambassador Waltz also had the opportunity to visit a warehouse run by the Jordan Hashemite Charity Organization, where aid procured with American taxpayer money sits in warehouses. Some of it is at risk of expiring. However, due to U.S. advocacy, humanitarian aid is transiting the Allenby crossing again, with World Food Program trucks passing through on December 10th. We will continue to work with our partners in Jordan and Israel to fully reopen the Jordan corridor for the more effective government-to-government route. This corridor is the most efficient and accountable route for providing much-needed aid to Gaza. The United States supports the need for clear security arrangements after a terrorist killed 2 Israelis on September 18th at the Allenby crossing. All parties must work to address these security issues so that the corridor can return to its prior level of operation. This council should also acknowledge that humanitarian aid has surged since the ceasefire began. The efforts of the United States and our partners are improving the humanitarian situation on the ground. Over 30,000 commercial and humanitarian trucks have entered Gaza, bringing food, shelter, and medicine, all thanks to the efforts of President Trump and the Civil Military Coordination Center, known as the CMCC. We continue to work with the UN and others so that supplies can reach those in need without diversion to terrorists or looters. With the USG and other donor support, the World Food Program is providing approximately 2 million hot meals daily within Gaza, and it is operating more than 200 bakeries. A successful vaccination campaign inoculated tens of thousands of children, protecting them from daily disease. Since October, the U.S. government obligated an additional $330 million to WFP and other NGOs to continue emergency food and shelter assistance. It also provides for field hospital support and to address water and sanitation needs. All of these improvements are the result of the hard work of the United States and our partners at the CMCC. We call on all in the Council today to contribute to our efforts with the CMCC and the International Stabilization Force. As Secretary Rubio stated, UNRWA is a subsidiary of Hamas. UNRWA operates under the absurd framework that treats Hamas like any other actor, and it rejects any reasonable standards for accountability or the vetting of its staff or partners. Colleagues, we have been clear. The United States opposes these quarterly briefings on UNSCR 2334, as they only distract from pressing threats to international peace and security. Resolution 2803, not 2334, charts the path towards a stable, safe, and prosperous Middle East. We are working with partners to stand up the International Stabilization Force and train fully vetted Palestinian police, not rehashing decades of failed policies. This council should recognize and end its outsized focus on an outdated resolution. The United States remains focused on keeping Israel secure and the Gaza and West Bank stable. President Trump has been perfectly clear that the United States expects the violence in the West Bank to end and that the United States will not allow the annexation of the West Bank. Perfunctory meetings like this one today are a distraction. The United States and its partners in the region will continue to focus on improving the situation on the ground, day in and day out. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Deputy Special Coordinator Alakbarov for his briefing. I would like from the outset to express Denmark's condemnation of the recent terrorist attacks in Sydney. We stand not only with Australia, but also with the entire Jewish community in rejecting all forms of terrorism and anti-Semitism. Mr. President, 9 years ago, this Council took a decisive step. In adopting Resolution 2334, the international community declared Israeli settlements a violation of international law and called for their immediate halt. It was an act of real solidarity in an effort to safeguard the two-state solution. Today, however, we face a situation of expanded settlements, intensified settler violence, and widespread displacement. Our failure to make real progress on this issue has long been deeply troubling. If we do not act decisively, it will soon be irreversible. The conflict in Gaza has rightly drawn the attention of the international community for more than 2 years, but support to Gaza must not come at the expense of our focus on the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Mr. President, let me highlight 4 critical points. First, all settlement expansions must be halted immediately and any attempt at de facto annexation prevented. Continued expansion of Israeli settlements, legalization of outposts, seizure of Palestinian land, and implementation of the E1 plan are threatening the territorial integrity of a future Palestinian state. Denmark strongly deplores all settler takeovers and demolitions, including in the Silwan neighborhood of East Jerusalem. We urge Israel to immediately halt these measures and recall the attempts to change the demographic composition of the occupied Palestinian territory to forcible transfers and deportations are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Denmark is also appalled by the forcible raid of UNRWA's premises in East Jerusalem on 8 December and remind Israel of its obligations to respect the inviolability of UN premises. As underlined by the ICJ, including in its most recent opinion, Israel is under an obligation to cooperate in good faith with the United Nations. Second, Mr. President, we must prioritize the protection of civilians. More than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since 7 October 2023. We are now hearing reports of an average of 5 settler attacks a day, the highest level in nearly 20 years. We call on Israel to ensure the protection of civilians in the West Bank and the wider occupied Palestinian territory in accordance with its obligations under international humanitarian law. Third, Mr. President, we must continue to support reform and revitalization of the Palestinian Authority and secure reunification of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, under their rule. While the Palestinian Authority is focusing on its reform efforts, resources are urgently needed. We once again call on Israel to immediately release all withheld tax revenues and to renew the relevant bank agreement on a long-term basis. We must prevent the development of parallel structures that might inhibit reunification of Palestinian self-determination. Inclusion of the Palestinian Authority in all matters relating to their territory is essential. Fourth, we welcome the comprehensive plan for Gaza, which was recently endorsed by Security Council Resolution 2803. Following the long-awaited ceasefire in Gaza, more aid is now coming in. However, we are still far from meeting the tremendous needs on the ground. We are concerned by the continuous restriction by Israel, including on dual-use items, and call for the opening of more border crossings, including Rafah, and continued access for international NGOs. INGOs play a crucial role in delivering humanitarian assistance throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. We are deeply concerned by Israeli registration requirements set to take effect on 31st December, which will limit INGOs' ability to operate in Gaza as well as the West Bank. We call on Israel to ensure the rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access in line with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, in closing, these demands are not new. They are rooted in resolutions passed by this Council, nor, regrettably, is the information in the sobering briefing we have received today. What must change is how we react. Denmark stands ready to work with all Council members to this end, to pave the way for a future of two states living side by side in peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Ramiz Alakbarov for his briefing on the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. We note the Secretary General's observations, including continued non-compliance with key obligations, particularly ongoing settlement activity and the lack of steps to reverse negative trends on the ground. At the outset, Sierra Leone condemns the recent attack in Sydney, Australia, during the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. We express our sincere condolences to the families of the victim. Mr. President, at the outset of our tenure, we recalled Sierra Leone's long-lasting engagement on this agenda item, including our first intervention in the Council in 1970, on the plight of the Palestinians and the need to pursue peace through conciliation and reconciliation. We also now recall a last statement in our first tenure in 1971, supporting Council action grounded in the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by conquest. Those principles remain relevant today. For Sierra Leone, the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question, remains fundamentally a matter of justice and the application of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. Our position has been consistent. We support a just and lasting peace through a negotiated two-state solution that guarantees Palestinian self-determination, ends the occupation, and ensures Israel's security. Today, the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains grave. The Secretary General's reporting confirms wide-scale devastation of civilian infrastructure, alarming levels of malnutrition, and continued impediment to humanitarian access. We reiterate the obligation to facilitate safe, rapid, sustained, and unhindered humanitarian access at scale required, and we stress the duty to respect and protect United Nations and humanitarian personnel, medical workers, and journalists, including UNRWA and other UN agencies, whose humanitarian mandates and immunities must be respected. We are equally concerned by the developments in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, marked by increased settler violence, settlement expansion, demolition, access restrictions, and inflammatory rhetoric. These trends undermine the contiguity and viability of a future Palestinian state. In line with Resolution 2334, settlement activity must cease and steps must be taken without delay to prevent violence against civilians and ensure accountability for perpetrators. We note positive developments in recent months attributable to sustained international engagement, including mediation efforts and the comprehensive plan endorsed by Resolution 2803, which helped reduce hostility, enabled humanitarian operation, and supported the release of hostages. While the ceasefire is largely holding and there are signs of stabilization in Gaza, reports from the West Bank, including the demolition, displacement, and movement restriction, remain deeply troubling. We also welcome diplomatic efforts to restore a credible political horizon, including the high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and implementation of the two-state solution, culminating in the adoption of the New York Declaration aimed at advancing the two-state solution through meaningful international collaboration. As Sierra Leone concludes its tenure on the Security Council, we underline 5 points. First, we reiterate our support for a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, grounded in international law, the protection of civilians, and a negotiated two-state solution, with an independent, viable, and contiguous state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in peace and security. This requires a negotiated settlement in which the rights, aspirations, and security of both Israelis and Palestinians are recognized, respected, and safeguarded in accordance with the Charter and relevant United Nations resolution, including by ending settlement expansion, demolition, incitement, and all actions that undermine prospects for peace. Second, we stress the imperative of compliance with international law and relevant General Assembly actions, including General Assembly Resolution ES 1024 of 18 September 2024, which addressed the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. These resolutions call for an end to action that harms civilians and undermine the two-state solution, and for affirmative steps to reverse negative trends. Third, Security Council resolutions, including recent Resolution 2803, must be implemented in good faith. We underscore the expectations set out in that resolution, including that the ceasefire be respected and strengthened, that civilians be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law, and humanitarian access be fully enabled and unimpeded, that the transitional arrangements lead within a defined time frame a unified and legitimate Palestinian governance over the occupied Palestinian territory. The cessation of hostilities must be consolidated into durable calm and coupled with credible steps to revive a political process that ends the occupation and restores a viable path to peace. Fourth, integral to the credible political process is the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations and the finalization of its statehood. The security of Israel and its full integration in the region must also be safeguarded. The viability of the two-state solution requires that both peoples see a future of hope, dignity, and mutual security. Fifth, the reconstruction of Gaza must also be addressed with urgency and integrity. Gaza's recovery cannot be deferred, nor pursued in ways that entrench displacement or fragmentation. Reconstruction should restore basic services and livelihoods, support the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of civilians consistent with international law, and advance unified and legitimate Palestinian governance within an agreed timeframe. Mr. President, Sierra Leone live with the hope that the Palestinian question will be resolved without further delay. The Security Council and the international community must continue to consolidate efforts to achieve a permanent and complete cessation of hostilities in Gaza and the West Bank, address the humanitarian crisis, and advance a credible political process. The Security Council must remain seized of this matter and act with unity and resolve. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone, and I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Panama is grateful to Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for presenting the quarterly report on the implementation of Resolution 2334, which offers a detailed and worrisome stocktaking of the situation on the ground, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Before beginning, I would like to express on behalf of the government and people of Panama our condemnation of the attack that took place in Australia during this Jewish celebration of Hanukkah, a holiday of peace. We would like to send our deepest condolences to the victims of the families whose holidays were marked by terror and extremism. The situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Mr. President, has continued to deteriorate over a long period of time. The most recent figures demonstrate a sustained increase in violence, forced displacement, and demolitions. This year, over 1,000 people have been displaced from Area C due to demolitions, as a result of lack of construction permits that have become practically inaccessible to the Palestinian population. We'd like to reiterate that the protection of the civilian population must be a priority at all times, in line with international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, as far as Gaza, the ceasefire enforced since October, achieved thanks to the efforts mediation by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, and supported by countries in the region, as well as endorsed by Resolution 2803 adopted by this Council, has allowed for a relative drop in the intensity of hostilities and a certain humanitarian improvement. However, the situation remains fragile. The most recent reports indicate that there are continued civilian victims, destruction of infrastructure persists, and over 90% of the population remains displaced, living in extremely precarious conditions. The humanitarian situation continues to be critical, recently aggravated by severe climate conditions that have led to the collapse of structures that had already been damaged, flooding in medical facilities, and new waves of displacement. Panama values and supports the efforts of the United Nations and its partners to step up assistance, including reopening of healthcare services, provision of food, and support to the displaced population. However, these efforts continue to be inadequate in the face of the scale of the needs. Bearing this in mind, Panama underscores that it is essential to maintain the presence and support of the United Nations and its specialized agencies in this new opportunity for peace in Gaza and the West Bank. We reject any action that affects the inviolability of UN facilities and those of its agencies, and we reiterate that the privileges and immunities of the United Nations must be respected without any exception. Mr. President, the comprehensive recuperation in Gaza requires that Hamas has no role in its future. A sustainable peace, the rebuilding of the Strip, and restoring a dignified living conditions for the civilian population in Gaza are incompatible with the presence of groups that use extremism. The future of Gaza must be under the leadership of reformed Palestinian leadership, a unified one, capable of guaranteeing security for its own population and for its neighbors. Panama reiterates that Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are integral parts of a future Palestinian state, and that the only viable, sustainable, and humane solution will be the one that allows for the people of Israel and Palestine to live side by side in peace, security, and dignity in line with international law and the relevant resolutions of this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the UK.
Thank you, President. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Alakbarov for briefing us today. 2025 has been a year of unimaginable suffering for Palestinian civilians in Gaza, for hostages and their families, and for the wider region. Yet there is cause for renewed hope. Thanks to the tireless diplomatic efforts of the US, Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt, we have a ceasefire. 47 more hostages returned to their families, and a 20-point plan for Gaza offering the chance of a peaceful future for the region. We call on all parties to uphold the ceasefire and fully implement Security Council Resolution 2803. Israel must lift all barriers to aid without delay,
and let international NGOs operate freely. At least 14 people are reported to have died since last week due to harsh winter conditions and flooding. We need medical supplies, shelter materials, and fuel delivered into Gaza now. UK-funded tents have entered Gaza to provide urgent shelter for families. This provides a lifeline for 12,000 vulnerable civilians. It is also vital that the remains of the final deceased hostage, Ran Gavili, are returned to his family. Hamas must disarm and unequivocally renounce violence. As we build a better future for Gaza, Palestinians must remain at the heart of transitional governance. And amidst progress on Gaza, we must not lose sight of the West Bank. It faces an unprecedented crisis, which risks undermining the 20-point plan and regional peace. So in that context, I'd like to make 3 points. First, this year has witnessed an unprecedented rise in settler violence against Palestinians, with 260 attacks in October alone. We condemn all such attacks. President Herzog and Prime Minister Netanyahu have committed to tackling settler violence. This must translate into concrete actions to protect Palestinian civilians and hold those responsible to account. We were shocked by reports of Israeli authorities entering an UNRWA compound on 8 December without authorization. UN premises are inviolable. Israel must comply with its obligations under international law. UNRWA plays an indispensable role supporting Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and in the region. Second, we reiterate our firm opposition to settlement policies that violate international law and any form of forcible annexation. The reported approval of 19 new settlements in the West Bank, continued evictions of Palestinian families in Silwan in East Jerusalem, and the expropriation of the entire Acropolis of Sebastia and surrounding lands take us further away from peace. Third, the economic situation in the West Bank remains on a cliff edge. We call on Israel urgently to release withheld tax revenues, increase shekel transfer limits, and confirm a longer-term extension for correspondent banking relationships to avert economic collapse. President, the year ahead offers a chance to turn a page on 2 years of tragedy and chart a course towards peace. The UK will work with all our partners to implement Resolution 2803, promote West Bank stability, and develop an irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, President. Pakistan joins colleagues in strongly condemning the heinous attack in Sydney at a religious gathering. We extend our deepest condolences to the families of victims and wish a speedy recovery to the injured. Pakistan unequivocally condemns terrorism in all forms and manifestations. We also thank Deputy Special Coordinator Ramiz Alakbarov for his sobering briefing. The Palestinian people have endured decades of illegal occupation marked by dispossession and denial of their inalienable rights. Over the past 2 years, this suffering has escalated to an unprecedented scale in Gaza. And more than 70,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed, with communities destroyed and essential systems collapsing. Despite the bleak reality, the international community has sought to preserve the possibility of peace. A high-level conference in July and the General Assembly's endorsement of the New York Declaration established a multilateral pathway to revitalize the two-state solution. And President Trump's leadership and persistent efforts resulted in the peace plan and the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, mobilizing regional and international actors around urgent priorities, namely ending the bloodshed, maintaining the ceasefire, responding to the humanitarian catastrophe, reuniting families with detainees and hostages, and reopening a credible political process towards Palestinian self-determination and statehood. Pakistan acknowledges the facilitation of the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey in this regard. These efforts culminated in the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2803, which Pakistan supported as part of the group of 8 Arab and Islamic countries engaged in this process and in full alignment with the position of the State of Palestine and the Arab countries. All these efforts reflect a shared recognition that the status quo is untenable and that only a political horizon grounded in international law can offer a way forward. No resolution of the Security Council can be unilaterally declared outdated. They remain relevant and in force until they are implemented. Pakistan's position remains principled and consistent. The Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory must end, and the Palestinian people must be enabled to exercise their inalienable right to self-determination through the establishment of an independent sovereign state of Palestine. President, the role of UNRWA remains crucial and cannot be allowed to be undermined by unwarranted and unfounded criticism. On 12th of December, the foreign ministers of 8 Arab Islamic countries reaffirmed the indispensable role of UNRWA in safeguarding the rights and well-being of Palestinian refugees. The ministers condemned the storming of the UNRWA headquarters in Sheikh Jarrah, neighborhood of East Jerusalem by Israeli forces, as this attack represents a flagrant violation of international law and the inviolability of UN premises. And it violates the advisory opinion of the ICJ of 22nd October 2025. The Secretary General's latest report on the implementation of Resolution 2334 paints an alarming picture. During the reporting period, Israeli authorities advanced over 6,300 housing units in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, with a significant concentration in Area C and sensitive areas such as E1. It underscores that settlement activity in 2025 has reached the highest levels since the United Nations began systematic tracking. These actions, as reinforced by the July 2024 advisory opinion of the ICJ and identified in Resolution 2334, have no legal validity and are a violation of international law as they continue to entrench the occupation and undermine the viability of the two-state solution. Looking ahead, Pakistan wishes to highlight following points. First, Resolution 2803 must be implemented in full and in good faith. The momentum generated at Sharm el-Sheikh must be sustained. The central role of the Palestinian Authority is indispensable. The second phase must be implemented without delay. Second, all settlement activity must cease immediately in line with Resolution 2334. Any attempt to alter the demographic, legal, or historical character of the occupied territories, including around Al-Haram al-Sharif, is illegal and must be reversed. Third, the ceasefire must be fully respected with no unilateral military actions. The withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza remains essential. Fourth, full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access must be guaranteed. Fifth, Reconstruction should begin without delay, with no annexation, forced displacement, or fragmentation of the occupied Palestinian land. Sixth, accountability is indispensable, as without justice and respect for international law, there can be no durable peace. And finally, a time-bound and irreversible political process anchored in relevant UN resolutions must lead to the establishment of a sovereign, independent, and contiguous state of Palestine on the basis of pre-1967 borders, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. That is the best guarantee for durable peace in the region. It is high time to turn promises into action and to speed up this process. Pakistan's solidarity with the Palestinian people remains unwavering. We stand firmly with them in their legitimate struggle for dignity, justice, and self-determination, and for the realization of an independent Palestinian state in accordance with international legitimacy. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, at the outset, Guyana condemns the attacks in Sydney during a Hanukkah gathering. We offer our deepest condolences to the families of the victims and to the government and people of Australia. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Alakbarov for presenting the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. The report confirms again that the provisions of Resolution 2334 continue to be openly violated, infringing on the rights of the Palestinian people and undermining the achievement of the two-state solution. Having examined the report, I wish to highlight 4 elements that are particularly concerning to my delegation. First, Guyana has noticed a growing proclivity by actors on the Israeli side to advance legal measures to extend settlement activity in the occupied West Bank. We have taken note, for example, of the introduction to the Knesset of 2 private bills extending Israeli law to occupied West Bank settlements. Though these bills did not advance beyond preliminary readings nor received government support, it is important to take note of the enabling culture that encourages lawmakers who wish to pursue objectives that collide with Israel's international legal obligations. Guyana therefore urges Israel to abide by its obligations as an occupying power, as stipulated in international law, including its obligation not to annex any of the territory under occupation. We reiterate our appeal for Israel not to further the implementation of the E1 settlement plan, which would further reduce Palestinian territory. We also underscore that the Israeli legislative measures of which I speak continue to come with extremely high costs to Palestinians whose properties are subject to demolitions and seizures, or who face heavy fines for refusing to comply with demolition orders. Second, on the issue of violence against civilians, regrettably, despite the achievement of a ceasefire deal in Gaza, hostilities continue with ongoing airstrikes, shelling, and gunfire. Hundreds of casualties have been recorded since the start of the ceasefire. Our anticipation had been that the ceasefire would have led to the silencing of the guns in Gaza and a flood of humanitarian relief for the ailing population, creating the conditions for recovery and reconstruction. The Secretary General's, as well as other credible reports, however, make it clear that the reality on the ground still requires drastic improvements, especially now that winter conditions have begun and last week's torrential rains, which brought heavy flooding to Gaza. Guyana calls on the parties to the ceasefire agreement to fully comply with the commitments undertaken for the protection of civilians and to advance Gaza's recovery. The full restoration of public law and order throughout the Strip is also important for this objective. Mr. President, while eyes are trained on Gaza, violence against civilians in the occupied West Bank continues unabated and at increasingly alarming levels, with the operation started by the Israeli security forces in January still ongoing. These operations have resulted in numerous fatalities and injuries, loss of property and livelihoods, and led to the forcible displacement of thousands of Palestinians. This Council must take active steps to protect the civilian population in the occupied West Bank and to halt the mounting violence. My third observation concerns the provision in Resolution 2334 for the parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. The peace we seek in the occupied Palestinian territory can be helped or hindered by messaging, particularly from key figures involved in the conflict or actors with strong influence. Guyana therefore urges responsible messaging on issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in compliance with Resolution 2334. And fourth, the persistent fiscal crisis faced by the Palestinian Authority is in no small measure attributable to Israel's withholding of revenue and the sword of Damocles it consistently hangs over correspondent banking agreements. If the PA and Palestinian institutions are to be strengthened enough to be able to build a viable Palestinian state, a strong economic base is foundational. In this context, member states and international corporations must halt all ongoing trade with illegal settlements, since such trade enables the humanitarian crisis driven by Israel's decades-long occupation. The Security Council should therefore consider how to address this aspect of Resolution 2334. Mr. President, as this is the last mandated meeting on the Palestinian question for 2025, and for Guyana's current term as an elected member of the Council, allow me to offer brief reflections on this file on the Palestinian question. From the very beginning, our conviction was and remains that strong political will is the key ingredient for moving the needle on the question of Palestine. In cases where it is lacking but needed, that political will can be encouraged, and the Council and the United Nations as a whole have ways and means to achieve this. It is our responsibility to combat the impunity with which all the actions directly impeding the resolution of the Palestinian question are carried out. To do anything less would be to consent to entrenched impunity. The comprehensive plan for ending the conflict in Gaza is a positive step in this direction. As we have said before, however, its implementation must be steeped in international law, and safeguarding and promoting the rights of the Palestinian people must be its centerpiece. The sustainability of the peace that emerges from this plan would be determined by how closely it adheres to these two factors, the rule of law and Palestinian rights. The central role of the United Nations on both aspects must be safeguarded, including by upholding the ICJ's advisory opinion on Israel's obligations in relation to the organization. On this note, Guyana strongly condemns Israel's actions against UNRWA's property in East Jerusalem as a flagrant violation of international law, particularly in light of the pronouncements by the ICJ on this matter. I conclude, Mr. President, by appealing to the entire United Nations membership to apply a simple but profound rule of thumb to all actions pertaining to the Palestinian people, and that is, because all people everywhere are born equal, the aspirations we have for our own people should not be different to the aspirations we have for the Palestinian people. For Guyana, that is certainly what has always guided our engagement on the Palestinian question. This will continue to guide us, even as we conclude our tenure on the Security Council, until Palestinians are free, in an independent state, living in peace and security alongside Israel. I thank you.
I thank Guyana for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank to Deputy Special Coordinator Alakbarov for his sobering briefing. At the outset, let me extend Korea's sincere condolence to the victims of the terrorist attack in Sydney, targeting civilians celebrating Hanukkah. Mr. President, Korea's term in Security Council started 2 years ago in the aftermath of the horrible terrorist attack by Hamas and amid the massive military response by Israel. Since then, the Republic of Korea, along with other members of the Council, have strived to establish concrete measures to minimize suffering on ground. We now have a ceasefire in Gaza, thanks to the efforts by the mediating countries, US, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. Yet, our sense of responsibility has not been relieved. As the humanitarian situation remains dire, attacks continue, and winter sets in. For over 2 years, far too many people in Gaza have been killed and maimed, including countless women and children. With the entire strip totally threatened and humanitarian aid still restricted, those living are still experiencing unimaginable daily indignity. Israel has also suffered greatly. Hostages were released, but not all of them returned home alive, and one body is yet to be recovered. We understand that the most atrocious terrorist attacks in Israel's modern history left unforgettable trauma on all Israelis. Mr. President, under this backdrop today, we meet again to discuss the implementation of Resolution 2334, a landmark resolution adopted 9 years ago, reaffirming the principled position of this Council. This resolution clearly provides, quote, that the status quo is not sustainable and that significant steps are urgently needed, end of quote, to stabilize the situation and to reverse negative trend on the ground. Unfortunately, however, harsh reality on the ground contradicts the unequivocal provisions of this Council's resolution. Indeed, contrary to paragraph 1 and 2 of this resolution, Israel has been rigorously expanding its settlements across the West Bank. Paragraph 6 calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians. However, we continue to witness unacceptable settler violence. Despite paragraph 7, we also continue to encounter provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric, both by Israel officials and Palestinian armed groups. It is also concerning that the work of UN agencies, including UNRWA, is being constantly impeded. The forcible entry of Israeli authorities into the UNRWA headquarters last week exemplifies, as its Commissioner General mentioned, blatant disregard of the obligation with regard to the inviolability of all UN premises. Mr. President, it is deeply regrettable that during our Council membership, we could not reverse this negative trend. However, in the same period, we could hear the ever-growing voice of the overwhelming majority of the international community, calling for an urgent transition from war to peace and from confrontation to coexistence. The international conferences on the two-state solution held in July and September were crucial occasions to reconfirm the wide support of the globe for the two-state solution. The adoption of Resolution 2003 last month also demonstrated common determination to bring the war in Gaza to an end and to move forward a new chapter. Mr. President, this meeting is the final mandated meeting on Palestinian question during our term in Security Council. Thus, let me reiterate our basic but most important positions on this vital issue. First, the Republic of Korea supports the two-state solution as the only viable path toward a just and lasting peace in the region. We believe that the establishment of Israeli settlement in the occupied Palestinian territory has no legal validity, and that all settlement activities must cease immediately. Second, settler violence is unjustifiable under any excuse, and perpetrators must be held fully accountable. Any other violent actions, including terrorist attacks by Palestinian armed groups, must also stop. All actors in the region must refrain from provocative actions and rhetoric. Third, Gaza must not return to its previous conditions. Both parties must halt military actions and abide by the ceasefire agreement, as reaffirmed in Resolution 2803. Hamas must lay down its weapons, and Israel must withdraw from Gaza, based on the standards, milestones, and timeframes under the Resolution 2803. Humanitarian aid, in cooperation with all UN agencies, must be ensured at scale. The reconstruction and development of Gaza must commence as soon as possible, and the entry of dignified shelter must be prioritized. In this regard, we commend the efforts by the US to implement the details of Resolution 2803, including the composition of the BOP and the deployment of the ISF. Fourth, a genuine process to advance political horizon between Israel and Palestine must resume. The role of the Palestinian Authority as the legitimate representative of Palestinian people should be guaranteed. We support the reform and revitalization of Palestinian Authority and object to any measure that undermines its viability, such as the withholding of tax revenues. These principles have been repeated numerous times. The Republic of Korea sincerely hopes that this Council will soon have meaningful discussions to realize this common aspiration, and will continue to do our part, both within UN and beyond. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank Mr. Ramirez Alakbarov, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and the head of the humanitarian section, and we also welcome the Secretary General's report on the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2016. The report once again provides a clear and deeply concerning assessment of developments on the ground and underscores the widening gap between the Council's decisions and their implementations. Resolution 2334 is unambiguous. It reaffirms that the establishment of settlement by Israel in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under the international law. Yet, nearly 9 years after its adoption, settlement expansion continues unabated at an unprecedented scale, particularly in the Area C and East Jerusalem. These actions systematically undermine the viability, continuity, and sovereignty of the future Palestinian state and erode the prospects for a negotiated two-state solution. Somalia remains deeply alarmed by the scale and the pace of settlement activity, land confiscations, demolitions, and forced displacement of Palestinians, including women and children. Such practices violate the international humanitarian law and international humanitarian human rights law and risk an amounting to a forcible transfer. This must cease immediately. At the same time, my delegation is gravely concerned by the escalating violence across the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The loss of civilian life and excessive use of force and settler violence against Palestinian civilians and the destruction of homes and infrastructures continue to fuel instability and despair. Civilians must never be targets. All parties must respect their obligations under international law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and accountability. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Palestine, particularly in Gaza Strip, remains catastrophic. While we acknowledge recent steps that led to increased humanitarian access, these measures remain insufficient given the scale of the destruction, displacement, and human suffering. We call for the full, safe, sustained, and embedded delivery of humanitarian assistance, including through all available crossings, and stress the essential role of United Nations and its agencies, particularly UNRWA, in alleviating human suffering. Resolution 2334 also calls for affirmative steps to reverse the negative trends on the ground. This requires more than rhetoric from the Security Council. It requires concrete actions by the occupying power, meaningful accountability for the violations, and consistent international engagement to preserve the political horizon. It also requires the rejection of incitement, inflammatory rhetorics, and all acts of violence, including acts of terror against the civilians. We underscore that the continued failure to implement Resolution 2334 weakens the credibility of the Security Council and sends a dangerous message of impunity. The Council must uphold its responsibility and ensure that its resolutions are respected and fully implemented. To conclude, Mr. President, we call on all parties to demonstrate a genuine political will to halt unilateral actions that undermine peace and to recommit to a credible political process. We further call on Israel to release all withheld revenues it collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. My delegation reiterates its steadfast support for the realization of an independent, sovereign state of Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital in accordance with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. Somalia will continue to stand firmly with the people of Palestine in their legitimate struggle for freedom, dignity, and self-determination. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Deputy Special Coordinator, Ramiz Alakbarov, for his sobering briefing. Let me start by expressing our full condemnation of attacks against Jewish communities worldwide, including recent attacks in Manchester and Sydney. We condemn in the strongest possible terms all forms of anti-Semitism and hate, intolerance, racism, and xenophobia, including anti-Muslim hatred. Mr. President, a month ago, this Council adopted Security Council Resolution 2803, which constitutes a crucial step towards advancing peace, security, and stability in the region. Building on the 20-point peace plan mediated by the US and regional partners, it provides a renewed impetus for efforts aimed at permanently disarming Hamas and extremist actors as a sine qua non precondition for a sustainable peace and stability in Gaza. It also lays out a path for restoring Palestinian self-determination and achieving a viable two-state solution. We need to step up the implementation of the peace plan so as not to lose the current momentum, and we call on all parties to abide by its provisions fully and in good faith. Turning to the Security Council Resolution 2334, which frames today's discussion, let me outline the following points. Implementing policies that contravene Resolution 2334 lead to rising tensions and instability in the West Bank. They also have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of international law. They constitute a serious impediment to the creation of contiguous, sovereign, and viable Palestinian state. The construction of additional settlement units and outposts, land confiscation, demolition of Palestinian homes, and displacement of civilian populations all undermine the prospects for peaceful coexistence based on mutual recognition. Against this backdrop, we are deeply alarmed by the sharp surge in settler violence in the West Bank, including attacks targeting Christian communities. We call for the protection of the Palestinian population in the occupied territories, including the Christian communities, and the preservation of the status quo of the holy sites in the old city of Jerusalem. Should the situation in the West Bank continue to unravel, it could further erode the prospect of a two-state solution. Equally concerning is the ongoing economic strangulation faced by the Palestinian communities resulting from withheld tax revenues and constrained financial flows. The economic viability of the West Bank is indispensable, not only for the livelihoods of Palestinians, but for the broader peace process. We therefore call for the immediate release of withheld revenues and for the restoration of a functioning Palestinian financial and banking sector. It is a prerequisite for meaningful self-governance and sustainable recovery. Mr. President, the role of the UN and its agencies, UNRWA in particular, remains central, and the SDICJ recently reaffirmed in its advisory opinion. A few weeks after the overwhelming General Assembly vote reaffirming the agency's mandate, Greece reiterates its full support for UNRWA's essential work. International solidarity and coordinated humanitarian assistance must remain steadfast, especially during winter, to alleviate suffering and uphold human dignity, particularly as harsh winter storms and low temperatures place vulnerable groups at risk in the Gaza Strip. We take heart in the continued and targeted efforts of the UN and its partners to deliver assistance. Such assistance must continue and be allowed to flow without impediments. Equally, we look forward to the convening of the upcoming conference on the reconstruction of Gaza announced by Egypt. Greece is ready to assist. Mr. President, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, the ancient Greek historian Thucydides describes the symbolic resilience of the olive tree. And to us, Greeks, the olive tree carries through the ages the powerful messages of resilience and peace. Extending an olive branch instead of uprooting the tree is in fact an act of wisdom. We remain unwavering in our conviction that the two-state solution is the only viable way to ensure peace, justice, and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. And we call on all parties to summon the political courage needed to advance along the second phase of the 20-point peace plan. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. At the outset, let me join other colleagues in condemning the terror attack in Bondi Beach in Australia. We convey our condolences to the families of the victims as well as to the people and government of Australia. I thank Mr. Alakbarov for presentation of the report mandated by the Security Council Resolution 2334. Colleagues, this is likely the last briefing on Palestinian question during current Council membership of Slovenia. Without a doubt, this is the defining issue of the work of the Security Council in this period, a question that will likely define the future of the international community. And I believe it was also a milestone that defined many of us as diplomats, on a professional level as well as on a personal, human level. Albeit with regular violations, ceasefire in Gaza is finally in place, and we continue calling on all parties to maintain it. But peace is nowhere near. Despite the repeated calls for respect of international law, countless and most egregious breaches were committed in Gaza on our watch. Despite not calling it as such, crippling annexation is taking hold in the West Bank. Without redress, we are bound for endless instability, hatred, and extremism. We must never forget the voice of Hind Rajab, the screams of people burned to death after a strike on a tent camp in Rafah, the testimonies of released hostages, the briefings shaking us to our cores as we witness people starving and humanitarian workers being killed while those responsible continue to act with impunity. And we must never forget many Palestinians still in Israeli arbitrary detention, among them many medical staff, including Dr. Abu Safia. Peace is nowhere near. In these 2 years, Slovenia acted with conviction of doing what is right. We were active in this Council through initiatives and calls for Council meetings, working particularly closely with Algeria and Guyana and other E10 members. We stood up to attacks against UNRWA through shared commitments supported by over 120 member states. We recognized the state of Palestine and offered direct financial support to the Palestinian Authority. We voted for Palestinian membership in the UN. We joined Norway in calling for an ICJ advisory opinion, and we stand in clear support to the ICC. What keeps us up at night are the unspeakable horrors taking place in Gaza, above and below the ground, and often overseen violations in the West Bank, such as demolitions in Bustan, displacements from refugee camps, settlement expansions, rising settler violence, or now building a new wall in the Jordan Valley, and plans to initiate land registration in the West Bank. We strongly condemn the forced entry of Israeli authorities into the UNRWA compound in East Jerusalem, the seizure of property and removal of the UN flag. Such actions violate the inviolability of UN premises and breach international legal obligations, as outlined by the latest ICJ advisory opinion. We call on Israel to fully respect international law and ensure the safety and protection of UN personnel. We express our profound concern over reports of consideration of sanctions against UNRWA and appeal against this step. What keeps us up at night is the amount of work that still needs to be done. The 3 most immediate steps must be to ensure ceasefire holds in line with Resolution 2803, that a pathway to a credible and time-bound political process is established on the basis of the New York Declaration, and that accountability is ensured. As in any other case, the future of Palestine must be discussed with Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority at the table, and with a strong role of this Council. Colleagues, Palestinians have no other land. Israelis have no other neighborhood. And we collectively have no other solution than the one of 2 states living side by side in peace and security, We simply should do more to prevent history from repeating itself. For now, peace is nowhere near. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, allow me to begin by commending Slovenia for its term on the Council. You have shown determination and courage, and you have been relentless in upholding the principles you pledged to honor, including the very moving statement that you just delivered. The Palestinian people will not forget what you stood for during your time on this council. I also wish to express our gratitude to the other outgoing members, noting that the elected members, the E10, have over the past 2 years demonstrated unprecedented leadership in the pursuit of a ceasefire to save lives, to save humanity, and to salvage international law on the path towards just and lasting peace. I will begin with Algeria, the Arab representative on the Council and a country close to the heart of every Palestinian, the country where we declared our independence. And I am proud that I was a young politician, member of the PNC, that was in that session, and I participated in the voting for the declaration of independence of the state of Palestine. And thank Algeria for its unwavering solidarity. Guyana has been among the strongest voices on this council, matching the powers of its words with the courage of its deeds. Sierra Leone has been a steadfast defender of international law, the expression of our shared humanity. And the Republic of Korea has been a consistent advocate for a ceasefire and for peace. All served with commitment to the Charter and the responsibilities of serving on the Council. We welcome the incoming elected members, Bahrain, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Latvia, and Liberia, and look forward to working with them to advance justice, freedom, and peace in the Middle East and beyond. Mr. President, I thank the Deputy Special Coordinator, Zamir Alakbarov, for his briefing and relentless efforts on the ground. Through him, we extend our condolences to the United Nations for the UN personnel killed in the line of duty and reaffirm our deep appreciation for the indispensable role of the United Nations under the leadership of the brave, principled Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The International Court of Justice has clearly determined Israel's obligations as the occupying power, including its duty to facilitate humanitarian relief by the United Nations and its agencies, including UNRWA, rather than obstruct their work, continuing to deprive the Palestinian people of life-saving assistance. Israel's response to the ICJ has been to double down on its breaches of the UN Charter and international law. It has violated the inviolability of UN premises by unlawfully seizing UNRWA's compound in occupied East Jerusalem, removing the UN flag, and raising the Israeli flag over it. The compound is now occupied, as is the city in which it stands. We welcome the overwhelming support for the renewal of UNRWA's mandate and for the resolution following up on the ICJ advisory opinion, and we call for this support to be translated into concrete measures, enabling the agency to continue its vital work in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank, and all other fields of operation in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria in support of the Palestine refugees. Mr. President, more than 70,000 Palestinians have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been injured or maimed. Thousands have been detained. An entire population has been displaced and starved. One figure captures the depth of this agony during the final months of the Israeli onslaught. The number of babies dying on the very same day that they were born in Gaza was 75% higher than before this war on our people began. That is why no one welcomes the ceasefire more than the Palestinian people in Gaza. But Israel has yet to cease fire. Since the 10th of October alone, nearly 400 Palestinians have been killed, including many children, and 1,000 more have been injured. Victims and survivors still await relief. Restrictions in humanitarian aid persist. People are enduring a painful, harsh winter without adequate shelter, spending days and nights in flooded tents, in inhumane conditions for 2 million people, including 1 million children who have already suffered far too much. Mr. President, we welcome the sustained engagement of the U.S. administration, including at the highest level, to support implementation of the ceasefire agreement. In this context, we welcome the visit of the U.S. permanent representative to the region. We also appreciate the efforts of the mediators and other international partners. We welcome the release of Israeli hostages and hope for the prompt return of the body of the last remaining deceased hostage to his family. We call for the immediate release of the thousands of arbitrarily detained Palestinians and condemned the abhorrent, inhumane conditions of their detention. Nearly 100 Palestinians have died in Israeli custody in the last 2 years due to torture, ill treatment, or medical neglect. We also call on Israel to release all withheld Palestinian bodies. Israel has described this practice as barbaric when it concerned Israelis, yet it has cruelly withheld Palestinian bodies for decades. This inhumane practice must end. Families must be able to offer their loved ones dignified burial. We further call on Israel and the international community to facilitate the recovery of thousands of Palestinian bodies still buried under the rubble, the bodies of children, women, and men, of entire families, and to clarify the fate of the disappeared. Palestinian families live amid ruins, often above mass graves, without the means to retrieve or even identify their loved ones. Their anguish is immeasurable. Nothing I could ever say here can convey their pain. Mr. President, as we approach phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement, allow me to reiterate several fundamental principles. Gaza is an integral part of the occupied Palestinian territory and of the State of Palestine as affirmed by this Council. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, constitute a single territorial unit. Their unity, integrity, and status must be preserved, and they must be unified under the Palestinian National Authority as affirmed by this Council. Israel must fully and without delay withdraw from the Gaza Strip as affirmed by this Council. This is essential for the success of any international stabilization force. Israel is confessing its aim to transform the yellow line into a border and to partition and annex Gaza, and continues to pursue the forced displacement of its population. This must end. There must be one independent and sovereign Palestinian state, one government, one law, and one legitimate security force across the Palestinian territory. The Palestinian National Authority, the government of the State of Palestine, is always ready to continue carrying its responsibility as it relates to our people and to our land in all components of the land of the State of Palestine, including the Gaza Strip. These principles are fully consistent with three core tenets articulated in President Trump's plan: no forced displacement, no occupation, and no annexation. Let me repeat: no forced displacement, no occupation, and no annexation. These are the words of President Trump. Mr. President, the unprecedented escalation of settler violence terrorizing Palestinian communities must be understood in the context of Israel's continual policy of displacement and replacement of our people. It is inseparable from settlement expansion, which has reached record levels, with more than 47,000 housing units advanced, approved, or tendered in 2025 alone. This violence unfolds alongside home demolitions by the hundreds, destructions of infrastructure, and uprooting of entire communities from northern West Bank refugee camps to the South Hebron Hills, from East Jerusalem to the Jordan Valley. Settler militias acting hand in hand with the occupying armies, systematically targeting our people. The objective is clear and unchanging: annexation. It is evident in East Jerusalem, the E1 area, and the Jordan Valley. It aims at destroying the territorial integrity of the Palestinian state, and with it, any chance for a just peace. This objective is openly declared by Israeli leaders and reflected in Knesset legislation, military orders, and daily actions on the ground. These are facts. The Security Council has been clear. Resolution 2334 reaffirming in unequivocal terms the Council's rejection of Israel's illegal settlement activities and annexation attempts, and demanding for their immediate and complete cessation. This resolution must be fully implemented. President Trump has been clear. There must be no annexation. This is also the position of the region and the international community. Israel must halt all settlement activities, reverse its decision to advance 19 new settlements, and ensure that the condemnation of settler violence translates into accountability, especially since such violence could not occur without the support or acquiescence of the occupying forces. The Israeli government is actively provoking escalation in the West Bank. Mass extrajudicial killings with over 1,000 Palestinians killed, mass displacement, nearly 40,000 Palestinians displaced in 2 years, widespread arrests, including of children, repeated assaults in communities, unabated incitement and violations of the historic status quo at holy sites, attacks on the Palestinian Authority, and incitement against the Palestinian people and officials, and the theft of our natural and financial resources. These policies are illegal, dangerous, and irresponsible. Israel must end, not entrench, its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, in line with the ICJ's 2024 advisory opinion. This illegal occupation and apartheid must be brought to an end. That opinion also clearly defines the obligations of third states. We call on all countries to comply with those obligations rather than be complicit in colonial policies that violate Palestinian self-determination and undermine all prospects for peace. Mr. President, all civilians deserve protection. All attacks against civilians must be condemned. In this context, we join all of you in condemning the terrorist attack at Bondi Beach, targeting Jews celebrating Hanukkah. Nothing justifies attacks against innocent people because of their faith. Such crimes can never be justified, and they should not be instrumentalized. We reject attempts to link such crimes to the recognition of Palestinian rights or statehood. This is irresponsible. Equally irresponsible is the suggestion that condemning Israelis' crimes somehow justify attacks against Jews. Jews are not responsible for Israel's action. Israel should not use them as shields, and no one should turn them into scapegoats. We reject any attempt to associate any religion with the crimes of state or non-state actors or individuals, whether Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. Many Jewish and Israeli voices have courageously denounced the genocide against the Palestinian people. This conflict is political, not religious. Nothing justifies anti-Semitism. Nothing justifies racism. Nothing justifies terrorism. Nothing justifies atrocities. All civilians must be protected without distinction. This is what humanity, legality, and morality demand, and the Palestinian people are not the exception. We extend our condolences to the families of the victims and to the government and people of Australia. Mr. President, neither the ceasefire in Gaza nor de-escalation in the West Bank can be sustained without the international community upholding the rule of law and its own obligations. The New York Declaration has charted a clear path forward. The Palestinian people are entitled to freedom, dignity, security, and full respect for their rights. The region yearns for shared peace, shared security, and shared prosperity. Enough suffering, enough killing, enough agony. President Trump's efforts have generated desperately needed momentum to stop mass killing and save lives. The ceasefire must be upheld. It has to become permanent. Illegal unilateral measures must be stopped. The illusion that violence and colonization being security must be abandoned. Shared peace, security, and prosperity in line with international law must be pursued without delay. No forced displacement, no occupation, no annexation. The path to a just and lasting peace is known. It is enshrined in UN resolutions. It must now become a reality for the benefit of all, and I thank you very much, Mr. President and dear colleagues.
I thank the permanent observer of the observer state of Palestine for the statement and for the kind words addressed to my delegation as well as to delegations of outgoing members. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Mr. Alakbarov for his briefing and his work on the ground. On Sunday, the 14th of December, the first night of Hanukkah, a terrorist attack took place at the iconic Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. At 6:47 p.m. local time, two terrorists opened fire on Jewish people gathered to celebrate. Among the victims were a rabbi, a 10-year-old child, a Holocaust survivor. 3 generations targeted by the same hatred and terror. Those killed also included an 82-year-old woman from Slovakia and a 27-year-old Jewish engineer from France. This grief does not belong to one community or one country alone. It reaches into nations represented in this chamber today. It reminds us that hatred and terror, once unleashed, do not stop at borders. In the midst of that horror, there was also courage. A Muslim, father of 2, Ahmad al-Ahmad, rushed forward, stopped one of the terrorists and wrestled the weapon from his hands. His actions saved lives. They showed what moral courage looks like when it matters most. This attack did not come out of nowhere. From the steps of the Opera House to the arches of the Harbor Bridge, incitement was visible. Hate was normalized. Inflammatory slogans were dismissed. When calls to globalize the Intifada are shouted openly, also here in the city of New York, when hate speech is tolerated, and when lies and media distortion are allowed to prevail, violence does not stay theoretical. Jew hatred festers. Extremists are emboldened. Let this attack be a wake-up call, not just for Australia and its government, but for every country represented here. When words of hate are left unchecked, terror does not retreat, it advances. Israel remains committed to confronting terror wherever it appears. We will not look away, we will not be silent, we are not afraid. We stand with the Australian Jewish community and all those who refuse to accept hatred, lies, and violence as the new normal. Hanukkah is a festival of light. It reminds us that even a small light can push back great darkness. We will never dim our light. Mr. President, as the year draws to a close, people around the world begin to reflect. They take stock of what worked, what failed, and what they want to do differently in the year ahead. That is why, at this time of year, people set New Year's resolutions, not just to declare intention, but to change outcomes. That is the spirit in which Israel comes before this Council today. Looking back over the past year, it is clear what worked for our region and what did not. What worked was a decisive leadership and moral clarity shown by Israel and its allies, especially the United States. Sustained diplomatic and military pressure delivered real ceasefires and created leverage for change. What did not work was hypocrisy and imbalance. Obsessive debates over Israel's right to defend itself here in the Security Council, political theater in the General Assembly, the weaponization of the ICC and the ICJ did not advance peace or improve humanitarian outcomes. Across our region and beyond it, the lesson is clear. Anti-Semitic hate fuels terror, and terror spreads when it is excused. So today, Israel is putting forward 5 New Year's resolutions for the Security Council to support a new regional reality: no terror, greater accountability, and deeper cooperation across the Middle East. The first resolution takes us to Gaza. 2 things must happen immediately. First, the last fallen hostage in Hamas captivity, Ran Gvili, must be returned. Second, Hamas must be disarmed. 2025 saw Israel achieve what many said was impossible. All living hostages are home now for Hanukkah. Many of our fallen hostages have been returned and given the dignity of a proper burial, but our struggle is not over. Hamas continues to hold the remains of one fallen hostage, Sergeant Major Ran Gvili. Last week, I met with his family in Israel. I saw their pain, but I also saw their strength and resilience. They are not asking for statements or sympathy. They are asking for dignity, for their son to be returned home for a proper burial. The reality is this: we know, we have the intel, that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they know where Ran Gvili's remains are, and we showed it to the mediators. They can recover and return them. They deliberately choose not to. They choose to violate the ceasefire. This Council itself has recognized the path forward when it endorsed President Trump's peace plan. But progress cannot be made while Ran Gvili remains in Gaza. It cannot move forward while Hamas remains armed. There is no future to Gaza while a terrorist organization controls it. You cannot rebuild a society while terror dictates daily life. This is not just an Israeli demand. It is a regional necessity. Hamas must be disarmed fully and permanently. From Gaza to Lebanon. I know many of you visited Lebanon a few weeks ago. You met officials there. But the pattern is the same: terror armed, terror funded, and terror protected. Resolution 2 confronts the source, Iranian-backed terror. We see it in Lebanon, where Hezbollah's weapons are not defensive. They are supplied, trained, and directed by Iran. And in Lebanon, you spoke with the leadership. Lebanon lives with a contradiction: a government that seeks stability while a terrorist militia operates with impunity. Israel does not seek conflict with Lebanon. We seek a different future. Recent engagement between Israeli and Lebanese officials shows what becomes possible when Hezbollah is weakened: economic cooperation and growth. But as long as Hezbollah remains armed, Lebanon cannot prosper. Ceasefire commitments must be honored. UN resolutions must be enforced. Dismantling Hezbollah's terror network is not about Israel. It is about Lebanon, its territory, its people, and its future. Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist organizations. This Council cannot tackle terror while refusing to name it. Designation is not symbolic, it is a prerequisite for peace. So I hope that now it is about time in 2026 for the Security Council to do what it has so far failed to do and formally designate Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist organizations. We have seen the cost of delay. The result is bloodshed. This Council must confront terror and radicalization wherever they appear, from Bondi Beach to Beirut to Gaza. That brings us to Resolution 3, the PA, the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, and the reforms it can no longer delay. Over the past year, Israel has presented this Council with clear evidence that the PA is not doing what it needs to do. It has failed to crack down on terror. It has not held elections, I think, in more than 20 years. It continues to incentivize and glorify violence instead of stopping it. You cannot build peace while paying for violence. You cannot fight terror while teaching hate. This Council should be clear about its expectations and firm in enforcing them. That is also true in Syria, the subject of our fourth New Year's resolution. Syria stands at a moment of choice. President al-Shara promises a new future for Syria, but this Council has learned that words alone are not enough. Legitimacy must be earned through actions. If Syria's leadership seeks acceptance, it must break clearly from the repression that stained its past. That means removing radical and extremist elements from positions of power, ending persecution, and protecting minorities. Our final New Year's resolution looks into the future of the region as a whole and the great hopes we have for it. The Abraham Accords prove that when countries choose pragmatism over rejectionism, the results are real. Normalization brought cooperation in trade, technology, agriculture, and security. The international community should encourage further normalization, deepen existing partnerships, support regional frameworks that reward cooperation rather than extremism. Mr. President, the 5 New Year's resolutions I have set out today are about a different future for our region, a future where terror is confronted, not excused, where anti-Semitic hatred is challenged, not tolerated. Distinguished members, as the New Year approaches, people everywhere think about their New Year's resolution. What worked, what failed, what must change. Our New Year's resolutions for the Security Council in 2026 are clear. Hamas disarmed in Gaza, Iranian-backed terrorist proxies dismantled, a Palestinian Authority that stops rewarding terror, a Syria that protects its people, and a Middle East defined by cooperation and peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I will now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.